This morning, we're going to be asking the question, is the church opposed to science? And is that truth or is it propaganda? Now, here's the thing. It's a big subject. There's some pretty complex ideas and theories out there, and your pastor, who's not an astrophysicist or a physicist or a microbiologist or an engineer, I'm going to try and take some very complex ideas, some scientific laws, and break them down so that my father, who only made it through grade 6, could understand it. So understand, I get that if it sounds a little simple, I'm trying to make it simple and by intent. So you want to stay with me because I'm going to cover a little history and I'm going to cover a little bit of science. And you want to stay with me because, folks, when we get through this, I think we're going to make the point that in the beginning there was a God. If somebody were to come up to you and ask you what is the most important question in the world, what would you say? I mean, when you think about it, there's a lot of great existential questions out there. Like, who am I? Where did we come from? What are we doing? What is the meaning of life? What's the purpose to life? Where are we headed, and are we there yet? A lot of great questions. I would like to suggest that the greatest question, and maybe the two greatest questions you could ever ask yourself, and by the way, if you ever engage in a Bible study with me, preparing for baptism or otherwise, I will tell you that these are the two most important questions you need to ask before you even get into the Word of God. And they are this. One, is there a God? And two, what is He like? I mean, if there is a God, and you've concluded there is a God, then that answers the questions you've been asking. All those existential questions get answered by the reality of a creator God. Who you are, where you come from, what are we doing here, what's our purpose, where are we headed, are we there yet? All of that is answered by, is there a God? He answers it all. But also, if there is a God, we need to know, what is He like? Is He for us or is He against us? Because that will change your religion. There are religions based on the idea that God is not for us, that you have to work to earn your salvation and please God and prove to God that you're worth saving because, well, if God doesn't like you, He can get rid of you. But if God is for you, now comes the gospel of grace. Because everything He does is because He loves you and He is determined to save you. The two most important questions in the world are right here. Is there a God, and what is He like? And the question, for those of you who are scientific and you like evidence, maybe the question you're asking is, okay, preacher, where's the evidence? I mean, if there is a God, where's the proof? Russell Bertrand asked the question. He said, where's the proof? It's a good question. Is there any? And the Bible says you're surrounded by it. It's Paul. He's talking in Romans, and it's chapter 1, verse 20. Look at this. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power, and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Do you catch what Paul's saying here? Paul's saying all the evidence you need is really look up, look down, look around you, because the evidence for God is there. You just got to open your eyes. But Paul said there's a problem. But Paul said, back in my day, he said, I got a problem because they know there's a God. They can see the evidence, but they want to suppress that information. And if they can't suppress the information, they want to change the way you see God. And by the way, you live in a world where they want to either suppress the revelation or they want to change the way you see God. And Paul actually says this. He says, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. So if they couldn't suppress the revelation of God, they're going to change the way you see God. So enter Charles Darwin. You've heard the name, you know the man, you know the book. And before Darwin came along, understand that science as a whole believed in a seven-day creation. They believed in God. They believed in the creation. They believed that the world was created in 7 days by this God, and we were made in his image, and all natural phenomena was interpreted through the Bible. When they looked at the Grand Canyon and geological formations, they saw a world that had been hit by an extinction-level event called the flood, and the world was interpreted through the creation narrative. The great minds, Galileo, Copernicus, Sir Isaac Newton, who created calculus, all of these great men interpreted the world and the universe around them through the creation story. And then along came Darwin. Darwin started out as a Christian. We know that. And then something went horribly wrong in his life. His 12-year-old daughter died. And he grieved. Oh, he loved that little girl. She died. And somebody had the audacity to tell him that because of how she died, she was now being tortured in the fires of hell throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity. And Darwin went black. He went dark. And he not only started hating God, but he started hating humanity. And so Darwin wrote this book. It's called The Origin of the Species. And when you now go to school and you're introduced to this book, that's the title, The Origin of the Species. But what most people don't realize, especially today, is that the original title of the book went more like this: The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. You think he could have published that today? There's no way he would have gotten away with that title today. This is... Now let me ask you, before I make that statement, who do you think, for Darwin, a white British citizen, who do you think he thought the favored races were? The whites. Understand, when we talk about slavery, you often think of the United States of America, but let me tell you something. Britain was as bad or maybe even worse when it came to the slavery of those who came from Africa. Their history is just as bloody and brutal, and Darwin's writing a book and he's saying, hey, we've got to preserve the favored races, and guess who they are? That's us white folks. You couldn't pass that off today. His book became the justification, and understand, you can research this. This is not my personal opinion. There's a book out there entitled Psychiatrists, the Men Behind Hitler, and in that book they make the historical case that this, in large part, contributed to Hitler's thoughts on Jews and the eradication of Jewish people. It wasn't the only influence, but it was a key one, and historians know it, and so does the scientific community. Let me ask you, why is it that they removed the bottom half of that title? Because they do not want you to understand the racist roots behind this book and the racist motivation for it. The reason they cling to it, and you got to ask yourself, why does science cling to a book whose intent was to prove the superiority of the white race? Why do they hang on to that book? Because it's the only intelligent argument they have to suppress the revelation of God. But if you can't suppress it, you got to change the way that people see God. So the book didn't actually change Christianity. Christians are still here. So what do we do about that? Well, we got to change the way people see God. And so now enter the poster child for the new atheist. His name is Richard Dawkins. He's a smart cookie, and he's very hostile to Christianity. For a man who says there is no God, he has an awful lot to say about God. I mean, if you don't believe in God, why are you even talking about him. Here's what Dawkins has to say about God. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, malevolent bully. What do you think Darwin's opinion is about God? Darwin goes from university to university, campus to campus, and he spreads this message about God. Because if you can't suppress the revelation, then at least let's change the way you see God, let's discredit God, and hopefully we will change the way you relate to God. But now, he wasn't the first one to actually go from campus to campus, place to place, doing this. Actually, the first one to do it was a guy by the name of Ezra Cornell. Now, you may not know the man, but how many of you have heard of Cornell University? He was a co-founder. And this man was an avowed atheist. He hated God, and he hated the church, and he hated those who went around telling people about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so he actually started spreading rumors about Christianity. One of his first rumors was this, is that Christianity held back and persecuted scientists who advocated that the earth was round. Now, here's the thing. Historically speaking, we know this is not true. We know that the church argued over the center of the universe, but by the time we got to Cornell, nobody was arguing the earth was anything but round. The Greeks had figured this out using math. They had figured out the earth was round by 500 BC. By the time we get to Jesus, everybody has accepted what the Greeks had discovered. It was being taught. It was common knowledge. By the time you get to the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, we know this. It's classical literature, it's classical education. Nobody was arguing against the fact that the earth was round. Oh, but then he came up with another one. He also spread the rumor that it was Christians who burned down the great library of Alexandria, and he said they did it because Christians were threatened by truth and information and facts. You'll even hear that today. But now, here's the thing. What we know from history is that there is absolutely no proof whatsoever that Christians burned down this great library. Absolutely no proof. I know there are people who believe it. There's even one famous Adventist speaker who's quoted this to say that back in the day, Christians were opposed to the pagans and the spreading of pagan information, so we burned down their library. Not true. Historians agree, or they generally agree, that the most likely culprit was Julius Caesar. There's absolutely no proof that the church did this. And by the way, Cornell would later go on to admit, when confronted, he admitted he made the whole thing up because he wanted to discredit Christianity. Oh, but he's tame compared to this guy. This is Thomas Huxley. Now, I understand that what I'm about to share with you is going to sound like a conspiracy theory. I get that. So just stay with me because there's actually a book on this. This guy was referred to as Darwin's bulldog. And he too hated Christianity, hated God. This is what he had to say. He said, "Can anyone deny that the old Israelites conceived God?" In other words, they made him up. Not only in the image of a man, but in that of a changeable, irritable, and occasionally violent man. Huxley was determined to eradicate the creation story from the public mind. And so he created an organization of men who were dedicated to Darwinian ideology, so much so that if you wanted to be in a position of power or influence, you had to adhere to and promote Darwinianism. You had to promote evolution. And so they created what was called the X Club. Sometimes they would be referred to as the X-Men. a group of people dedicated to promoting the idea that humanity will advance through evolution. Here's what Ruth Barton writes. Armed with Darwin's Origin of the Species, Huxley made it his mission to make sure that Darwinian ideology would replace biblical theology among the ruling class of Great Britain. If you wanted to lead, you had to change your theology to ideology, which is why this series is so important, because we've been asking the question, are you going to follow ideology or theology? So, Huxley said that Christianity is opposed to science. And the question we have to ask is this, because he said it, Cornell said it, Dawkins is saying it. We have to ask ourselves honestly the question, is Christianity opposed? And we have to ask, is it true or is it propaganda? Is it true? Are we against science? Are we so biblically minded that we oppose science at all costs? Or is that propaganda? Is it a twisting of the truth to push a narrative? In this series, I've shared with you that one of the things the secular world wants to do is to knock the Jesus out of you. And there are ways it does that. And one of the ways it does that, I shared this with you, is something called choice architecture. Choice architecture is designed to force you into making a desired choice. So, for example, I shared with you, the question might be posed to you, are you pro-choice or do you hate women? Right? Are you pro-family and therefore are you pro-white supremacy? Do you see how manipulative it is? Basically, they're using false comparatives to force you or to direct you into making a desired decision. But what happens if I can't get you or convince you or manipulate you to make the choices I want you to make? Then the next thing I have to do is figure out how to silence you and shut you up. And there's a propaganda tool that they use that you've been subjected to. It's all around you. It's in our schools, it's in our media, and it's in our politics, and it is a technique known as jamming. Jamming is designed to keep you from speaking up on important social issues. Jamming is a propaganda tool that is designed to create a negative association with something or someone. Why? So that when people think about it, they naturally want to avoid it or not be associated with it. So why do you think that right now they are saying in the world that we're opposed to science? That if you want to be a Christian, you got to turn your brain off. To be a Christian is to be a bigot, a supremacist. You have to be a misogynist. To be a Christian is to be what's wrong with this world. Do you see the association they're trying to build with being a Christian? And the intent, the purpose of this is, well, if we can't change you from being a Christian, then we're certainly going to shut you up because, hey, if you're a Christian, you're a supremacist, you're a bigot, you're a hater, you're what's wrong with this world. And who would want to go to school? Who would want to go to work and admit that? Apparently, a lot of people have gone silent and they've been jammed because they feel it is not safe for them to talk about the important social issues. So, enter Cato Institute. You can look this up. It's a recent study. They discovered that 52% of Democrats, 59% of independents, 77% of Republicans are silent on political issues because they fear that if they say the wrong thing, they might get fired and lose their livelihoods. In other words, they've been jammed. Here's what they discovered. They found that 1 in 3 Americans, 33%, who work say they are worried about missing out on career opportunities or losing their jobs if their political opinions become known. If I can't change the way you decide, I'm going to ensure that you don't have a voice. And so when people come along and they say that, well, if you're like that, then you must be this negative label, understand they're creating an association so you will feel bad about belonging to it and you won't talk about it. So who wants to be opposed to science? Who wants to be ignorant? Who wants to be a hater? And anybody in here want to be known for that? Of course you don't. But you got to ask, is the label true or is it propaganda? Is Christianity opposed to science? And so the question I want to ask is there actually any evidence in science for a creator God? Is there any evidence in science that might actually support the creation story? I'm going to turn to science. I mean, I can turn to the Bible and people will say, well, yeah, but the Bible supports its own narrative. So let's turn to science and enter. Now understand, before I go there, I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about this. When was the last time the church was opposed to math? Some of you might hate math. I used to think math was of the devil. But do we oppose math? Have we ever opposed physics? We haven't even challenged chaos theory. We don't go against quantum mechanics. We don't challenge the laws of physics. We don't even challenge general relativity. Name the last time we actually took a stance against science that can be observed, tested, and reproduced. As Christians, we have no problems embracing science that can be observed, tested, and replicated. We know 2 + 2 is 2. We know about it's 4. So apparently Pastor Bob has a problem with math. I love being ADD, I tell you. So thank you. I appreciate that. But you get what I'm saying. We don't have a problem with the fact that 2 + 2 is 4. We don't have a problem with string theory. We don't even have trouble with Einstein's theory of gravity and time. The church does not challenge the scientific laws and principles. If you can observe it, test it, and replicate it, we don't have a problem with it. And we call this simply, at a simple level, we call this the scientific method. Now, if there's scientists here and you're finding this painful, I apologize in advance. I'm telling you, I'm not a scientist. I'm trying to make this simple. The scientific method assumes 3 things. That our own personal biases can and will distort how one interprets what they observe. We all have cognitive biases. We all have a filter through which you observe the world, you experience the world, and that also includes the Bible, people. We talked about this when we talked about Bible interpretation a couple of years ago in Sabbath school. We all come to the world with biases and filters, which is why we pray before we get into the Word of God, because we need the Holy Spirit to help us with our filters. The scientific method assumes you have one. Therefore, we should always question the science because of our own biases. We always question, we always test, we always prove, we always try to move forward. And therefore, there is no such thing as settled science. This is one of the great complaints of the church, because we're hearing a lot of people say the science is settled, and we're going, it's never settled. So if they're saying it's settled, it's not science, it's ideology. Richard Dawkins tried saying that some of the evolutionary theories are actually settled science. And the scientific community fortunately took him apart for it, because there's no such thing as settled, because we all have biases. And so it is imperative to observe, to test, and replicate. And we continue to do it with all science. And it's important that we do. So, is there truly a huge gap between religion and science? Is it truly as big as they try to make it out to be? Or is it, as the picture shows, and I'd like to suggest, the gap is smaller than you can imagine? The issue between religion and science boils down to this right here. This is the crux of the debate. Origins. The origin of the universe, all the matter that's in it, where did it come from? And the origin of life, how did life begin? This is where we differ. You need to know we don't differ with all aspects of the evolutionary theory. We don't. We know about adaptation and change, that things evolve, they mutate, and they change over time. We don't question things that can be observed, tested, and replicated, and the theory of evolution has aspects that we go, yeah, we agree with that. We don't have a problem with the survival of the fittest or the fact that things try to find a niche in which it can survive. Some of you are like, I didn't know I was going back to grade 6. We don't question the science on certain aspects of evolution. The gap is not as big as you think. But it's the most important gap in the history of the world. Is there a God? Because this speaks to a God. If we're here by random chance and an accident and change over time, it changes the question of how did we get here? Who am I? What is the meaning of life? But if there is a creator God, it changes the answers to all the questions. And so, I'm going to try and take and bring it down to this. So, is there science that supports a creation narrative? Enter the laws of thermodynamics. Now again, I'm making this simple. You read this online, it's going to be worded a little differently, but here's the principle. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. As my wife put it last night, something doesn't come from nothing. That's the scientific principle. Something doesn't come from nothing. And so, as I look back over the issue, so here's why this is important. Because the first rendering of the Big Bang Theory that I grew up with went something like this. There was a point in time when all the matter in the universe came together, and because of gravity, it compressed and it compressed and it compressed until it got down to a tiny dot. All the matter in the universe, all the stars, galaxies, planets, all the dust, all the asteroids, it all compressed down to a small dot. And then it got hot and it exploded. And the matter just began to spread throughout the universe. And the reason they believe that is because things in the universe are spreading apart. They are. David talked about it. God, you spread the heavens like a curtain. The universe is spreading apart. Galaxies are moving apart from other galaxies. And so how did that happen? Well, they theorized it had to be a bang. But then they ran into a problem. Not only is the universe expanding, but it's speeding up. The expansion is actually speeding up. And things are now so far apart, billions of light years apart, that they realize there's not enough gravity in the galaxy to bring it all back together again. So their original theory of compression, expansion doesn't fit the gravitational models. It doesn't. So then along came Stephen Hawking, and he started to change the way we saw the creation of the universe. And he said, okay, guys, we need to rethink this. And so basically what he said was, in the beginning, there was absolutely nothing. The start of the universe began with nothing, and if you pick up an elementary school science book on the creation of the universe, they will read, in the beginning was nothing, and nothing means nothing. Nothing is nothing. And we don't have a problem with that. Genesis 1:2, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was covered the surface of the earth. Great starting point. Stephen, I agree with you. But then here's what Stephen argued when people asked, where did the matter come from? Because matter cannot be created by itself. Something doesn't come from nothing. Here's what Stephen had to say. The universe wanted to be, so the universe created itself. You can look it up for yourself. I'm actually hoping you'll do that. Go and check it out. It's what he said. It's what the textbooks are saying. In the beginning was nothing. So church, I'm going to call this Hawking's black box. And I want you to imagine that I've squished the outer space, the emptiness of space, down to this black box. And I want you to imagine that Hawking got it right, that inside this box is nothing. Because nothing means nothing. There's no light, there's no oxygen, no atoms, quarks, or leptons, there's no gravity, there's no laws of physics, there's not a molecule or an atom to be found. Inside Hawking's black box is nothing. It's nothing. Nothing means nothing. I agree with them. So I want to ask you, how long will my black box, or Hawking's black box, have to sit here before an explosion takes place on its own? Do you understand my question? How long does that box of empty space have to sit here before an explosion takes place all on its own? No laws of physics, no gravity, no nothing. How long would it take? Let's forget the explosion. How about a piece of sand? Just a speck of dust happens on its own. How long will my box have to sit there before something on its own happens inside the box? How many, do I have 1,000 years? Do I have 1,000,000? How about 1,000,000,000? How about 13 billion? What, no takers? Do you see where I'm going with the question? And I get, for some it might seem a little simplistic. This is the argument. If something doesn't come from nothing, and it all began with nothing, where did the something come from? How long does Hawking's black box have to sit here before an explosion takes place or matter takes place inside that case? Science says it can't be done. Something doesn't come from nothing. Matter cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed. You take energy and you use energy to create matter. Okay, but here's the thing. Before I go there, I want to ask you a question. Which is more scientifically plausible? Hawking's idea that out of the nothingness of the universe created itself, violating the law that something doesn't come from nothing, or the creation story that says God took his own energy, that this all-powerful God took his own energy and he converted that energy into matter. Which one fits the science? That's all I'm asking. Which one fits the science better? That matter created itself, or that an all-powerful God using his own energy created the matter in the universe? Okay, but let's say, just for a moment, let's say they got it right. Let's say an explosion took place in my box. I want to ask you, if I were to open the box, would I find in there a fully functional watch? Would I find a functioning iPhone? Would I find a functional set of glasses? Would I find a good pair of socks? For those online, I was told just one. And actually, brother, that fits more than maybe you realize. Because I want to ask, when was the last time an explosion created anything that was of order? When did order ever come out of chaos? Because you see, there's this other law that says everything moves towards chaos and decay unless something or someone intervenes. In other words, it all goes downhill unless something changes the direction. So let me ask you, when was the last time an explosion built a house? When was the last time an explosion? Have you ever seen a car explode? I want you to imagine I blew up your Prius and it turned into a Lamborghini. I'd have people out in the parking lot next week. Do you hear what I'm saying? You can't blow up an outhouse and turn it into a mansion. Never in the history of explosions did an explosion ever create anything but chaos. But in order to believe the origins of the universe, science is telling us it was an explosion and it created all the order that you're a part of. Now let me ask you again, which is more scientifically plausible? That the universe was created, the order of the universe is the result of a chaotic explosion that somehow formed order, or that the universe is the product of intelligent design and a maker who created the order. This isn't my only problem with origins. This is the origin of the universe. You follow me? I don't have enough faith, and by the way, for those of you who wonder what we Christians mean when I don't have enough faith for this, I don't have enough faith to believe that Hawking's box can produce an explosion all on its own that will create the order and the matter of the universe, violating every scientific law that we know. I don't have enough faith for this. I also don't have enough faith for the idea that life comes from non-living life. Enter Louis Pasteur. He grew up with this Greek thought, and the Greeks taught this. It's the idea of spontaneous generation. It's the idea that living things can pop up out of dead things. And there was a real belief that dead things gave life to living things. And one of the reasons why they believed this had to do with what happened to meat if you left it out too long. Now, if you leave a good slice of beef or fish out on the counter and the house flies get at it, what's going to happen to that piece of meat the next day? Maggots, right? Flies land on the meat, lay their eggs, maggots grow. And what happened was, people could see the flies landing on the meat, but what they couldn't see were the eggs. And so they couldn't make a connection between the flies and the maggots. Pasteur did. And so we conducted an experiment. This is early science stuff. I mean, I learned this in grade 10. So what he did was he took the meat, put it in a container, put a cloth over the container so the flies couldn't get at it, and guess what? No maggots. Here's what he went on to say. He is the father of biogenesis. This idea that complex living things come only from other living things by means of reproduction. In other words, dead things don't give life to living things. Or as he put it, all life is from life. Again, this is science. So which is more scientifically plausible, that the mud or some ooze, some chemical mixture somehow managed, this dead, unliving thing managed to produce life, violating the law of established a scientific principle? They still test it, but they haven't found any other theory. They haven't been able to undo this yet. Which is more plausible, that you came to life from some mud chemical mixture that's not alive, or that an all-living God took his life and he breathed it into us and gave us life? All life is from life. And here's what Paul said. The evidence for all of this is there all along. God was determined for you to know him. It's there. You just had to look up. You had to look down. You just had to look around. And the evidence for a creator God is there, which is what Paul could say forever since the world was created. People have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. God is determined that you should know him. God is determined that the evidence be there. You just have to look around. So you have to ask yourself, are we the product of a chance accident random mutations, all of which violate the laws of good science? Or were you, as the Bible says, in the beginning, there was God, and God created the heavens and the earth?